My name is Raymond Melville. I'm 79 years old, a retired high school principal from Vermont, and for the past 6 years I've been living alone in the house I once bought with my late wife, Virginia. It's a modest, two-story place tucked at the edge of a small, windswept town, surrounded by a slow-growing garden, a creaking white fence, and memories so loud they sometimes drown out the silence. I still fix my coffee the way Virginia used to. 3 scoops, half a spoon of sugar, dash of cinnamon, a stubborn ritual that always tastes like something's missing. I still read the morning paper, even though the ink smears and the stories feel like they're meant for someone younger. I still talk to the framed picture of her in the kitchen, telling her when the tomatoes are almost ripe, or when the wind reminds me of that trip we took to Maine in '76. It's not madness, it's continuity. It's the only conversation in this house that feels honest anymore. Since Virginia passed, the walls of this house have become both my refuge and my prison. I keep everything in order: clean floors, tidy drawers, nothing left to rot in the fridge. I may live alone, but I'm not some disheveled widower with slippers and soup cans. I still dress every morning in slacks and a pressed shirt. I still polish my shoes, and I still know the names of the presidents and the capitals of every state. People see an old man and they assume erosion, as if time always washes away dignity. But I've lived too long, worked too hard, and stood too straight to let that happen quietly. I am not fading. I am not fragile. And yet that's exactly what they see. By they, I mean my daughter Caroline and her husband Paul. Caroline is my only child, and until recently, I still believed there was some kind of warmth left in her. Maybe I saw it out of habit, or maybe I just confused obligation for affection. It's hard to admit that someone you once carried on your shoulders, someone whose skinned knees you bandaged and whose nightmares you chased away with bedtime stories, could now look at you and see nothing but liability. But that's what it's come to. Caroline works in financial compliance, a phrase she says like it's supposed to impress. She wears glasses now, not for vision, but for authority. Her voice is crisp like a spreadsheet, and everything about her feels measured and sanitized. She lives in a suburb an hour and a half away from me, in a sterile 2-story house with beige walls and no soul. She married Paul 12 years ago, an IT consultant who speaks like a manual and smiles like a placeholder. He once shook my hand with 2 fingers. 2. That's the kind of man he is. I hadn't visited their home more than a handful of times in the last decade. The invitations grew rare, the tone colder. The grandchildren, Sophie and Ben, once drew me pictures and mailed me letters. Now they barely look up from their screens when I call. I don't blame them entirely. Children learn what they're taught, and my daughter has been teaching them that I'm something to be tolerated, not loved. A relic, not a man. I never demanded anything from Caroline. I never asked for help with groceries or rides to appointments or even holidays together. I made it my mission to be the kind of old man no one had to worry about. I kept my finances in order, maintained my health, never imposed. But as the years passed, I began to notice subtle shifts. Conversations shortened. Her calls became less about checking in and more about logistics, bills, property taxes, paperwork. One time she asked if I'd considered downsizing. Another time if I'd thought about long-term care plans. It always came with a nervous smile and that phrase, "We just want what's best for you, Dad." But I heard the subtext. What's best for me was whatever made things easiest for them. The truth is, I started falling more often. Nothing serious, just slips. Once in the garden, once on the porch steps, once getting out of the shower. I never told Caroline. I didn't want to give her ammunition, but somehow she found out about the last one. The doctor asked if he could inform a family member, and before I could object, she was already on the phone. "Dad," she said later that day, her voice softened artificially, "I think it's time we talk about you staying with us for a while." At first I resisted. I told her I was fine, that I had neighbors nearby, that I had food in the fridge, that I was more capable than she thought. But Caroline is persistent in a way that doesn't feel like love. She speaks in legal terms. We just want you somewhere safe. We can help with your medications. It's temporary. Paul joined the call at one point to tell me they'd already prepared the guest room. They both framed it as a generous offer, a family gesture, a change of pace. But there was an undertone I couldn't ignore, and this wasn't a choice, it was a relocation, and it didn't feel like home, it felt like surrender. Eventually, I agreed. Not because I trusted them, but because part of me wondered if I was being too proud. Maybe they really did want to reconnect. Maybe it would be good to be near my grandchildren. Maybe Virginia would have told me to try. She always believed in second chances. And even though the house was full of ghosts and the quiet was becoming unbearable, I didn't want to die in isolation. So I packed a small bag, just the essentials. I left my house as if I'd be back in a week. I took one last walk through each room before I left. The study where I used to grade papers. The living room where Virginia would fall asleep watching black and white movies. The kitchen that still smelled faintly of her Sunday roast. I stood at the foot of the stairs, listening for a sound that didn't come. I whispered goodbye to no one, locked the door behind me, and stepped into the next chapter of my life with something heavier than fear. Resignation. Caroline picked me up in her spotless sedan. She didn't get out to help with my bag. Paul stayed home to set things up, she said. The drive was mostly quiet, filled with FM static and small talk about weather. I looked at her profile as she drove, her jaw tight, her eyes hidden behind tinted lenses. I wondered when my daughter became a stranger. I wondered if she'd always been this way, and I just refused to see it. When we pulled into her driveway, everything looked staged. The house was neat to the point of sterility, the lawn cut like a diagram. The welcome mat said, "Bless this mess," but there was no mess, and certainly no blessing. Paul met us at the door, smiling like someone hosting a charity dinner. "Come in, Ray," he said, "not Dad, never Dad." I stepped into their house carrying only a weekend bag, but in my chest I carried something much heavier, a growing sense that I was walking into something I wouldn't easily walk out of. And I was right. From the moment I crossed the threshold into Caroline's house, I felt the shift, not in temperature, not in the air, but in the very atmosphere, like I'd entered a stage where my role had already been written by someone else. The guest room they'd prepared for me was on the first floor, tucked behind the laundry room, windowless and dim, with a narrow twin bed pushed into the corner and a nightstand that looked like it had been taken from a motel clearance sale. There was a lamp with no bulb, a digital clock blinking 12 o'clock, and a single chair with uneven legs. On the dresser was a folded paper with a Wi-Fi password and a laminated list titled House Guidelines. At the top, in bold letters, "Please do not touch anything without asking." That sentence hit harder than I expected. I sat on the edge of the bed, rereading the list. No adjusting the thermostat. No food outside the kitchen. No unplugging or moving electronics. Laundry on Tuesdays only. Showers limited to 10 minutes. If assistance is needed, please notify Caroline or Paul in advance. It didn't read like guidelines. It read like a boarding house notice. I thought back to what Caroline had said over the phone. Temporary. Safe. You'll be with family. But this wasn't family. This was containment. That first evening set the tone. Paul gave me a tour of the house, pointing out things as if I were a child in a museum. "Here's the kitchen, but we prefer you don't cook. Just let us know what you need. The pantry's labeled by category. Please don't rearrange anything. The living room has the television, but we mostly use streaming services that require our accounts. If you'd like to watch something, let us know. The bathroom is shared, and we'd appreciate it if you could leave it the way you found it." Every word was spoken politely, but with that tight-lipped restraint people use when they're laying down the law. Caroline stood behind him, nodding like a co-director of a small, joyless film. They'd constructed an entire ecosystem where my presence was managed, not welcomed. It became clear very quickly that this wasn't a visit. It was a supervised stay. During dinner, I sat at one end of the polished dining table while Paul and Caroline exchanged updates about their schedules and the children's extracurriculars. Sophie had joined a STEM club. Ben was struggling in math. They asked me nothing. I tried to interject once, mentioned a book I'd been reading about Lincoln's cabinet, but the topic was dismissed with a vague, "Sounds interesting, Dad." And then we were back to discussing which brand of almond milk Caroline preferred. They served a quinoa salad and grilled chicken, portions already plated. No seconds were offered. When I asked for salt, Caroline hesitated before saying, "We're trying to limit sodium in the house." It's just healthier overall. I ate in silence, swallowing not just the bland chicken but the realization that I'd been invited here not to be included, but to be controlled. That night, I lay awake listening to the sound of the dishwasher and the occasional floorboard creak. The sheets were stiff, the pillow synthetic and too high. I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what this arrangement truly was. I had imagined shared breakfasts, maybe helping Ben with homework, perhaps telling Sophie stories about Virginia. I had hoped for some kind of reconnection. But this didn't feel like an open door. It felt like a waiting room for some process I wasn't privy to. The next morning, Caroline greeted me in the kitchen, already dressed in business casual, holding a protein bar in one hand and her phone in the other. "We've arranged a schedule, Dad," she said, handing me a typed document. It was color-coded by day and time, listing everything from breakfast window to quiet hours. She had allocated 45 minutes in the evening labeled family time. When I looked up, puzzled, she added, "Structure is good, helps everyone stay on the same page, and we just want you to feel secure." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I didn't have the strength to start a conflict before 9 a.m. Over the next few days, the feeling of being a guest hardened into something more clinical. Paul installed a baby monitor in the hallway outside my room, explaining that it was just in case you fall or need help in the night. They began pre-portioning meals for me, and leaving them in containers labeled Dad Lunch or Dad Dinner, even though I never asked for such a thing. One afternoon, I was folding my sweater in the living room when Paul walked in and said, "Caroline prefers we don't leave personal items around. She's very sensitive to clutter." I felt the flush of humiliation crawl up my neck as I took the sweater back to the room they'd given me. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about reminding me where I belonged, and where I didn't. Interactions with the grandchildren were minimal. Sophie, now 15, seemed to float from room to room with headphones on, her eyes glazed with teenage detachment. Ben, 12, barely spoke unless prompted, and even then with monosyllables. I offered to help him with homework once, and he looked up from his tablet and said, "It's fine." Mom hired a tutor. That evening, when Caroline and I were alone in the kitchen, I mentioned how distant the kids seemed. She gave me a tight smile and said, "They're just adjusting." It's not personal, but I knew it was. They'd grown up learning that Grandpa was a separate entity, someone who lived far away and likes his own space. I wasn't a memory. I was an occasional obligation. The final straw came a week into my stay. I was feeling restless and decided to take a walk around the block. I left a note, as any considerate person would. When I returned 40 minutes later, Paul was waiting by the door, arms crossed. "We were worried," he said, though his tone was more annoyed than concerned. "You really should tell someone when you leave." I reminded him about the note. Yes, but what if something happened? Caroline came into the hallway holding her phone. "Next time, please just wait for one of us." "We'll go with you," I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask them if they realized I'd been living independently for decades, that I was still capable of navigating a sidewalk. But I said nothing. I walked past them, back to my room, and closed the door. Behind it, I let the weight of this arrangement settle into something bitter. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about care. This was about control masked as kindness. That night, after they all went to bed, I sat by the tiny desk in my room and stared at the list of house rules again. My eyes lingered on that first sentence. Do not touch anything. It wasn't just about objects. It was about my place. I wasn't part of their world anymore. I was an intrusion they were trying to manage with polite smiles and printed schedules. I opened the drawer, found a pen, and wrote 3 words beneath their typed instructions. This is not home. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning. The moment I recognized that my presence here was not an act of love, but a strategy. I was not a guest. I was an asset under supervision. And when people start managing you like property, they almost always want to own something you have. They just haven't told you what yet. It was sometime during the second week of my stay that the invisible curtain between us finally dropped. If before Caroline and Paul were merely polite to the point of condescension, now their restraint began to crack in subtle, yet unmistakable ways. The tone of their voices sharpened slightly. The pauses before their responses grew longer, and the daily check-ins turned from artificial warmth to quiet supervision. I noticed how often Paul would hover in the hallway when I went to the bathroom, how Caroline had started locking the liquor cabinet, and how the living room television was always logged out of their accounts when I entered, requiring a password only. They knew. These weren't accidents. These were the carefully measured distances people create when they want to make sure you know you are not wanted. Not really. They just didn't want me to leave too soon. At least, not before they were finished with whatever it was they had planned. One Thursday afternoon, I overheard Caroline on the phone in the kitchen while I was meant to be resting. Her voice was hushed, deliberate, and what she said wasn't intended for my ears. Yes, we've started compiling the medical timeline. No, he's not aggressive, just confused sometimes. Leaves things on the stove, talks to himself. He wandered off last week. We had to go look for him. My heart slowed. She was talking about me. And she was lying. I hadn't left anything on the stove. I hadn't talked to myself any more than anyone does when thinking aloud. And I hadn't wandered off. I went for a walk around the neighborhood, left a note, returned in less than an hour. None of it was cause for concern. But Caroline was building a narrative, constructing a version of me that served a purpose I couldn't yet see. I stayed very still, holding my breath, hearing her continue. The doctor said early signs of cognitive decline. We just want to make sure he's safe. Legally, I mean. We're trying to get ahead of it. I backed away from the hallway like a thief in my own story. That night, I ate my dinner in silence, listening to them talk about nothing. Paul's meetings, the kids' school activities, the price of almond flour. All I could think about was what they were planning behind my back. I looked at Caroline differently now. This wasn't concern. This wasn't even manipulation. This was extraction. She was laying the groundwork for something. Guardianship, maybe. Financial control. Something involving power. I had heard of such things, of children easing their elderly parents into medical narratives, quietly gathering evidence to prove incompetence so they could gain legal authority over their lives. It always sounded like something that happened to other people, until it was you. 2 days later, a man named Gerald came to the house. Caroline introduced him as a friend from her estate law firm, just dropping by to talk generally about elder legal protections. "Just routine stuff, Dad," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear in that precise way she always did when she was hiding something. I sat in the living room across from him, the fake leather folder on his lap, the pen in his hand poised not for conversation but for extraction. Gerald was smooth, practiced, the kind of man who uses the word partner instead of husband and calls everyone my friend. He asked a series of questions under the guise of concern. Did I have a will? Who had power of attorney? Had I thought about transferring the house in Vermont into a trust for my protection? I answered as vaguely as I could, trying to suppress the rising panic. I hadn't signed anything yet, but I knew where this was going. That night I checked the drawer in which I kept the folder with my personal documents, passport, copies of financial statements, the notarized deed of the house Virginia and I had lived in for over 40 years. It had been moved, not stolen, but moved, slightly shifted and reorganized in a way I would never have done. A few pages were in a different order. A paperclip that had once fastened a small packet of documents was now crooked and loose. I stared at the folder for a long time, then replaced it exactly as it was, knowing now that the sanctity of my space was an illusion. It was around that time that I began to feign absent-mindedness. I wanted to know how far they would take it, how quickly they'd jump on any perceived mental lapse. One morning, I forgot to close the refrigerator door, only to hear Caroline cluck her tongue behind me with an exaggerated, "Oh, Dad, again?" Another time, I pretended to misplace my keys and watched Paul take quiet note of it in his phone. I dropped the name of the wrong grandchild on purpose once, mixing up Sophie and Ben, and later heard Paul telling Caroline in the hallway, "It's progressing faster than we thought." I could almost admire the efficiency with which they built the case. Sudi around me, carefully, methodically, like engineers constructing a bridge they planned to burn the moment I stepped on it. The most telling moment came one afternoon when I walked into the kitchen and found Sophie sitting at the table, texting on her phone. I tried to engage her in conversation, asked how school was going, whether she was still into astronomy like she used to be. She answered in nods and shrugs. Then I said, "You know, your grandmother used to say you had a sky inside you, that you were made for stars." Sophie didn't look up. "Mom says Grandma was depressed a lot," she muttered. "Said she was lonely because of you." I froze. "Is that what she told you?" She shrugged. "She said you didn't listen to Grandma, that she did everything, and you just sat there." That lie, weaponized through the mouth of my own granddaughter, cut deeper than anything Caroline had said directly. They were rewriting history, turning Virginia into a victim, and me into a bystander. I knew that voice. It was Caroline's, echoing in the mind of a child, molding memories that didn't belong to her. Later that evening, while I sat on the patio pretending to read, I heard Caroline and Paul through the kitchen window. "We'll need that signature before next week," Paul was saying. "The lawyer can backdate it if necessary, but it's cleaner if we do it while he's still under the roof." Caroline sighed. "I just hate how slow this is. I mean, we're doing the responsible thing, but he keeps acting like everything's fine. It's not fine. He's deteriorating. You heard him today. He didn't even remember Sophie's name." "He's stalling," Paul said. "He knows something. Maybe he didn't hit his head hard enough when he fell." They laughed, a low, mean kind of laugh. I closed the book I wasn't reading, my hands trembling. They weren't just taking liberties. They were executing a plan, and I was no longer just inconvenient. I was an obstacle. I spent that night awake, running through every conversation, every time Caroline had offered to help with the bank, every time Paul had asked for a quick signature on something. I thought about the house in Vermont, the only thing Virginia and I had built together, and how easily it could be taken if I didn't act soon. The next morning, over breakfast, Caroline placed a packet of papers beside my oatmeal. "This is just a formality," she said, pouring her coffee. "It's for health proxy. So, if anything happens, we can make decisions on your behalf. It's not about now. It's just in case I open the folder slowly." It was 10 pages long, filled with legal language. I read each line while she fidgeted with her spoon. "I'll need time to think about this," I said calmly. She smiled, tight and forced. "Of course, Dad. Take all the time you need." But I could see it in her eyes. She'd expected me to sign immediately. They were counting on my compliance, on the polite, tired old man they believed they'd worn down. That day, I called a cab while Paul and Caroline were at work. I took a ride to a quiet corner of town and stepped into the branch of a small credit union where I'd opened an emergency account 10 years ago, just in case. I deposited the remaining checks I had in my suitcase, requested copies of my account balances, and asked to block access to any third parties. I told the woman at the desk to add a security phrase to my file. The phrase was Virginia's favorite quote from Dickens. "No one is useless in this world who lightens the burdens of another." I walked out into the autumn light with the wind against my face and the sudden, frightening clarity that I could not stay there any longer. If I did, they'd take more than my papers. They'd take my voice, my story, my name. What they didn't realize, what they had never understood, is that I wasn't senile. I wasn't slipping. I was watching. And what I saw was betrayal, dressed in pastel sweaters and warm lighting. What I saw was a daughter who had once wept in my arms, now waiting to carve up what little I had left. And I knew then, if I wanted to survive this with any part of myself intact, I'd have to take back control. Not just legally, not just financially, emotionally, spiritually. I would not go quietly into the role they had written for me. I would not be a footnote in their convenience. The curtain had lifted. The performance was over. Now it was my turn to write the script. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and windless, the kind of day where everything outside the window seems like a painting someone forgot to finish. Caroline had gone to work, and Paul was upstairs in his office, pretending to be too busy to notice me walking down the hall. I could hear his fingers tapping on a keyboard, the occasional dry cough he always made before a Zoom call. I knew their patterns by now, their rituals of distance and control. They never checked on me unless it suited them, and they only smiled when they needed something. That morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to finish writing my obituary with polite smiles and forged signatures. I was going home. I'd quietly gathered my things over the previous 3 days. Medications, identification, the last few personal belongings I hadn't yet surrendered to their system of quiet erasure. I kept everything packed in an old leather satchel that Virginia had given me on our 25th anniversary. I hadn't used it in years, but somehow it felt right that it would carry what remained of my freedom. I called a cab company and asked them to pick me up at the corner 2 blocks away from the house. "I'll walk there," I told the dispatcher. "Just don't honk." I don't want anyone inside the house knowing she didn't ask questions. Just gave me a quote and an arrival time. That silence, that lack of curiosity, it felt more like kindness than anything I'd received in weeks. When the time came, I slipped out the back door and walked through the alley, moving slowly but deliberately, my heart pounding harder than it had in years. At every turn, I expected Caroline's voice behind me, some command, some theatrical plea. "Dad, where are you going?" But no one came. No one noticed. I was invisible to them until they needed a signature or a story to tell the lawyer. The cab pulled up exactly on time. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a worn baseball cap, helped me with my bag. "Heading far?" he asked as we merged onto the main road. "Home," I said. "I'm heading home." It took us nearly 3 hours to get back to my house in Vermont. I stared out the window the entire ride, watching the landscape shift from suburb to open road, from plastic strip malls to familiar wooded stretches that had once been part of my morning walks. When we pulled up in front of my house, I felt something inside me loosen. The porch sagged a little more than I remembered. One of the shutters was hanging slightly crooked, but it was still mine, still standing, still waiting for me. I paid the driver with cash I'd hidden from Caroline's watchful budgeting, thanked him, and stood for a long moment at the base of the steps, letting the wind touch my face like an old friend. Inside, the air was stale and cold, but clean. I hadn't been gone long enough for anything to rot, but dust had started reclaiming corners. I turned on the lights, opened the windows, and walked through the rooms one by one, not just to inspect them, but to remind myself that I existed here. This was the place where Virginia had danced barefoot in the kitchen, where we'd hosted Christmas for 20 years, where I'd fallen asleep reading Twain on countless rainy afternoons. No laminated rule lists, no cameras, no soft surveillance. Just memory, silence, and the quiet hum of dignity. The next morning, I drove to the office of a man named Daniel Thurber, a lawyer I had met once during a local historical society event and who had given a short talk on elder financial protection. He remembered me immediately. "Mr. Melville," he said, standing to shake my hand. "What brings you in?" I told him everything. Not just the facts, but the feeling of it. The surveillance, the lies, the slow erosion of autonomy. He listened carefully, occasionally taking notes, his brow tightening as the story unfolded. "They've started preparing medical documentation," I said. "I'm sure of it, fabricated or exaggerated. They want guardianship, power of attorney. They want access to the house and what's left in the accounts." He nodded slowly. "It's more common than you think," he said. "They dress it up as care, but really, it's acquisition. They think they're entitled." He opened a file and began listing the steps. "We'll need to file a revocation of any existing powers of attorney. Create a new trust for the house with a beneficiary of your choosing. Secure your bank accounts under new protections. And if they've already submitted anything to the court, we'll need to counter it preemptively." I exhaled. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself. "I want everything airtight," I said. "I want there to be no way back in for them." "Not ever again," Daniel nodded. "Then we'll get to work." That evening, after I returned home, I found the answering machine flashing. 9 messages, all from Caroline. The first few were casual, performative concern. "Hey, Dad, just checking in. Hope you're settling in okay back home." The next were more urgent. "We really need to talk. Can you please call me? It's important." And the last one, delivered in a voice tinged with both fear and fury. "Dad, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're making a big mistake. You're not thinking clearly. Call me back." Now I didn't. Instead, I sat in the living room, lights low, Virginia's photo beside me on the table. I spoke aloud to her, as I often did when no one was listening. "They almost had me, Jenny," I said. "They had the story halfway written. Frail old man loses his grip. Daughter steps in. Bank accounts moved. House transferred. Maybe an assisted living brochure left conveniently on the breakfast table. Also civilized. Also clean." But not this time. I paused, feeling my chest tighten, not with fear, but with anger, fresh and bitter. They treated me like a piece of furniture that talks back, like something you make room for while secretly planning where to store it. It was then that I made the final decision, not just to protect what I had, but to reclaim what they tried to strip from me. My right to be difficult, stubborn, fully human. I would no longer shrink myself to make others comfortable. I would not hand over my life in tidy little legal parcels. I had weathered war, buried a wife, outlived colleagues, and seen friends disappear into hospital rooms in silence. I knew what dignity looked like, and I knew when it was being stolen under the guise of love. They would come for me again, I was sure of it. There would be more calls, maybe a visit. Paul would bring paperwork. Caroline would wear her concerned daughter mask, all softness and veiled threats. But this time, I was ready. This time, I would meet them not as their version of me, doddering, confused, grateful, but as the man they had forgotten, I still was. Their plan had already begun to fall apart the moment I walked out of their house and into my own. And they didn't even know it yet. The first knock on the door came 5 days after I'd returned home, just after noon, while I was standing in the kitchen peeling an apple, the blade sliding with that smooth, familiar resistance through the skin. I had expected it, though maybe not so soon. Through the front window, I saw Caroline standing on the porch, her arms crossed, a leather satchel clutched tightly against her hip like a legal weapon. I let the doorbell ring once, twice before opening it. "Dad," she said, breathless with forced patience, "we need to talk." I stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in, but she didn't move. "Paul's in the car," she added, as if that were some reassurance. I told her to come in if she wanted to talk. Nothing would be said on the porch for the neighbors to overhear. She finally entered, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floor, and I could feel her discomfort the moment she crossed the threshold, like she had expected something different. Dust, disarray, the mark of a man unraveling. Instead, the house was clean. The air smelled of cinnamon and coffee, and the sun poured in through the windows just as it had for years, illuminating not decay, but quiet persistence. She walked into the living room and perched at the edge of the armchair like a poised threat. "We're very concerned," she began, her voice carrying the strained notes of someone practicing empathy like a second language. "You left abruptly. You didn't say anything. We didn't know if you were safe. Do you understand how serious that was?" I sat across from her, letting the silence stretch just long enough to force her to look me in the eye. "I left because I was no longer welcome," I said simply. She opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. "Don't pretend it was anything else. You monitored my movements, controlled what I ate, fabricated stories about my memory, and brought a lawyer into your house under the guise of a friendly visit. You didn't want me there, Caroline. You wanted what I have?" Her face flushed, but she held her composure. "That's not true. You're twisting things. We were trying to help. You've been struggling since Mom died. Anyone can see that. Struggling," I repeated, almost smiling. "Because I live alone? Because I take my own walks and pay my own bills? Or because I haven't handed you the deed to my house and the keys to my bank account?" She stood abruptly and began to pace. "This is ridiculous. Paul and I have been worried sick. We didn't know where you were, if you were hurt, if you'd fallen." "You knew exactly where I was," I interrupted. "You've known from the start. What you didn't know is that I still have enough clarity to protect myself. That I still remember how betrayal sounds, even when it's dressed as concern." She exhaled sharply and retrieved a folder from her satchel, holding it out to me like a peace offering, though the gesture carried the energy of a trap. "This is just paperwork to clarify things. A cohabitation agreement, some medical authorizations, nothing binding, just formalities. I didn't take it. If it's nothing binding, you won't mind if my lawyer reads it first." She stiffened. "You hired a lawyer?" "Of course I did," I said, rising from my chair, "because I know what you're doing. And it's over." She looked at me, eyes narrowed, then turned toward the door. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "Paul and I were trying to help you. But if this is how you want it—" "It's exactly how I want it," I said, "and tell Paul not to come onto my property again. If he does, I'll have him removed." She opened the door, stared at me for a long second, then left without another word, slamming it harder than she needed to. I stood in the entryway for several minutes after she was gone, the silence ringing in my ears like an aftershock. I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the first strike in a war they were convinced they could win. 3 days later, a letter arrived in a thick white envelope bearing the seal of a firm I didn't recognize. It was a formal notification from a law office representing Caroline and Paul, alleging concerns about my mental fitness, referencing erratic behavior, potential cognitive decline, and concerns raised by family members. It was a request for voluntary evaluation and a preliminary inquiry into the possibility of adult guardianship. I brought the letter straight to Daniel, who read it with a kind of cold disgust. "They're moving fast," he said. They want to force a court review, and they're hoping you'll react emotionally and give them the very evidence they need to prove instability. What's our move? I asked. He leaned forward. We go on offense. We file a counterclaim affirming your legal and mental capacity, attach notarized statements from your doctor, your neighbors, your financial institutions, and we notify the court that any guardianship motion will be contested with full legal. Resistance. And if they fake documents, I asked, then we get forensic experts. We escalate. I've seen this before, and I've won. I nodded. Then let's begin. The following week became a flurry of signatures, documents, affidavits. I underwent a complete mental health evaluation at Daniel's recommendation, including cognitive testing, psychological assessment, and a neurological workup, all of which concluded the same thing, that I was in full control of my faculties, independent, and showed no signs of cognitive impairment. The results were notarized, stamped, filed. I began receiving mail from Caroline's lawyers nearly every day now, motions, discovery notices, even a request for financial disclosure. At Daniel's direction, I ignored all direct communications and let him handle the replies. My phone rang constantly, and when I finally changed my number, Caroline left voicemails at the house, increasingly desperate, increasingly venomous. "You're blowing this out of proportion, Dad," she said in one. "We're trying to keep you safe." This isn't what Mom would have wanted. That last part stung. Using Virginia as a pawn in their scheme was more than dishonest. It was cruel. I deleted the messages without replying. Then, one night, a car pulled into my driveway and idled for almost 10 minutes. I watched through the blinds without moving. Paul was behind the wheel. He didn't get out. He just sat there, headlights off, engine running, like a vulture circling too early. The next morning, I found a business card shoved through my mail slot. "Let's talk," it read. "Before things get worse. Paul." I tore it in half and threw it into the fireplace. It burned easily, like paper that had waited its whole life to disappear. And yet, despite all the maneuvering, all the threats, all the legal sleight of hand, something inside me had begun to shift. Not fear, not anger, those were already well worn, but a grim kind of resolve, something colder and clearer than I'd felt in years. I no longer felt like a victim of their plans. I felt like a strategist. I knew where I stood now. I had allies. I had evidence. I had time. And for the first time since Virginia's death, I had purpose. The last move they made came in the form of a temporary restraining request, filed quietly, claiming that I had displayed volatile tendencies and posed a risk to household harmony, if allowed further contact with Caroline or the grandchildren. Daniel laughed when he saw the language. "They're trying to portray you as a danger now? This is desperation." "It's slander," I said. "They're building a fiction." "Then let's dismantle it," he said. We filed our final set of documents that week. A full petition for legal protection of my estate, a revocation of any prior informal financial arrangements with Caroline, and a formal request to subpoena all communications between her and the law. Firm, pushing this narrative, Daniel told me that once discovery opened, we would see everything: emails, texts, internal memos. If there's even a hint of manipulation or fabrication, he said, we'll find it. That night I sat by the fireplace, the flames low and steady, casting long shadows on the walls that once held the laughter of my family. I thought about the years I had spent believing that silence was a form of peace, that going along with things would preserve harmony, that love could excuse anything. But Caroline had taught me something different. That sometimes the people you raise, the ones you protect and nurture, grow into strangers. That not every bond survives betrayal, and that protecting yourself isn't selfishness, it's survival. They had pushed, I had pushed back, and now the walls they'd built around their version of me, The fragile, forgetful old man they thought they could maneuver like a chess piece had collapsed under the weight of truth. They didn't know the man they were dealing with. They had forgotten the principal who once ran a school of 1,200 students, who negotiated with union leaders, calmed angry parents, and stood up to school boards with more politics than sense. They thought age was an erasure. They were wrong. Age is memory sharpened, experience hardened, strength redistributed, and I would show them. It was just after 10 on a cold Thursday morning when I received the call from Daniel that the court date had been set. A hearing had been scheduled in probate court, one that would decide whether the petition for guardianship that Caroline had insisted was protective had any legal standing at all. Daniel sounded calm but firm, his tone carrying the practiced confidence of someone who had done this dozens of times but still understood the personal stakes involved. "They're not backing down," he said. "Their attorney submitted an amended complaint yesterday, pushing the claim that you've become erratic, that you're a threat to yourself. They're using your return home as evidence that you're resistant to care. Their strategy is to portray your independence as delusion." I felt a strange calm settle over me as he spoke, the kind that follows after a long series of blows, when the worst thing you can imagine has already been attempted and failed. "Then it's time they see the truth," I said, "not the version they've been writing." In the days that followed, I gathered every piece of my life I could think to bring with me. Not just paperwork and statements and test results, though I had plenty of those, but photographs, letters, certificates of commendation, old newsletters from the school where I had worked for over 30 years, all with my name printed boldly across. The top as principal and mentor. I even found an old VHS tape which I had transferred to a USB drive of a retirement ceremony held in my honor. In it, Virginia stood beside me as the students gave me a standing ovation. I wasn't trying to impress a judge with nostalgia. I just wanted to show who I really was before they began crafting a shadow version of me to serve their ambitions. The morning of the hearing, I dressed deliberately in the suit Virginia had helped me pick out for our 40th anniversary. Dark gray, wool, well-tailored even after all these years. I shaved carefully, polished my shoes, and buttoned my cuffs with the same steady hands that had once tied my daughter's shoelaces. As I walked into the courthouse with Daniel by my side, I felt not fear, not dread, but a quiet anticipation, the same I used to feel before addressing a room full of restless teenagers, nerves and purpose braided together. Caroline and Paul were already seated in the courtroom when I entered. Caroline wore a navy blue suit, severe and buttoned to the neck, her hair pulled into the same tight chignon she wore at her college graduation. Paul sat beside her in a dark blazer, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Neither of them looked at me. Their lawyer, a man in his early 40s with slicked-back hair and an expensive watch, rose when we entered and greeted Daniel with a handshake that looked more like a wrestling match. Then the judge entered, an older woman with short gray hair and a demeanor that said she had no time for games. The proceedings began with Caroline's side presenting their claim. Their lawyer described me as a man in cognitive decline, citing behavior that was increasingly erratic and oppositional, mentioning my escape from their home, the dangerous independence, and repeated references to my refusal to accept care. He used words like vulnerable and unpredictable, painting a picture of a man teetering on the edge of mental incompetence. Caroline was called to testify. She did not look at me as she spoke. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but she quickly found her rhythm, slipping into that tone she used when justifying unpleasant decisions to her clients. "We love my father," she said. "We only want what's best for him. But he's not the same. He's withdrawn, forgetful. He refuses to take his medication. We've had to call to check on him constantly, and still, he wandered off one day without telling anyone. We were terrified Paul was next. He spoke less convincingly, his tone more irritated than concerned. He described me as combative, said I, frequently misunderstood instructions, and accused me of leaving doors unlocked, endangering everyone. His words stumbled at times, but the image he painted was consistent with Caroline's, an old man who needed help and didn't know it. Then Daniel stood. He was methodical, measured, but beneath that calm there was iron. He presented the evaluations, the medical letters, the documentation of my cognitive capacity. He pointed to the sudden legal actions, the timing of the guardianship request directly following my decision to leave their home, and the attempt to establish power of attorney through routine paperwork. He handed the judge a timeline of events, showing how Caroline's concern only seemed to intensify after I withdrew financial access. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, steadied myself, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," I began, "I've been many things in my life. A teacher, a principal, a husband, a father, and I understand that age changes us. I understand that sometimes it's hard for our children to see us as we are, rather than as they fear we're becoming. But I am not incompetent. I'm not in decline. I'm simply inconvenient to a version of events that doesn't serve their plans." I pulled out the photograph of Virginia and me at our retirement party and held it up. My wife and I built a life from scratch. We didn't have much, but what we had, we earned together. This house, this savings, this quiet life, they are what remains of her, and I will not hand it over to anyone under false pretenses. I paused, looked at Caroline, who for the first time in the entire hearing dropped her eyes. I know what it looks like when someone cares. It doesn't involve monitoring their walks or rationing their food. It doesn't include lawyers and deception. It looks like presence, patience, and love. I sat down, my breath caught in my throat, but steady. The judge asked a few more questions, calm, procedural, and then called a recess. During the break, I remained seated. Caroline and Paul stepped out with their lawyer, avoiding my gaze. Daniel leaned toward me. "You did exactly what you needed to do," he said. "Now we wait." An hour later, the judge returned and gave her decision. The guardianship petition was denied, citing insufficient evidence, an intact cognitive profile, and the appearance of financial motivation from the petitioners. She recommended a cease of all legal contact unless initiated through attorneys, and issued a cautionary remark about weaponizing guardianship procedures. Caroline went pale. Paul's mouth tightened into a hard, bitter line. I felt no triumph, only release, like a long-held breath finally exhaled. Outside the courthouse, Caroline approached me for the first time. Her voice was low, sharp with shame and fury. "How could you do this to us?" she asked. "Do what?" I replied. "Defend myself." She looked like she wanted to spit something cruel but couldn't find the words. Paul touched her arm, but she pulled away. "You're not the man I thought you were," she said. "No," I said. "I'm the man you hoped I wouldn't be." A man still standing, I walked away from the courthouse, the cold air biting but fresh, each step forward feeling lighter, cleaner. I had no illusions about reconciliation. That bridge had burned, but I had protected something more important. My memory, my autonomy, my truth. They had tried to take it from me, to recast me as a helpless figure in their controlled narrative. But I had rewritten the ending. And it was mine. In the weeks following the hearing, a peculiar silence settled over my life. Not the kind that follows tragedy or loss, but the quiet that remains after you've closed a door and locked it from the inside. Caroline didn't call again. Paul, unsurprisingly, never reached out. The voicemails stopped. The letters stopped. Even the passive-aggressive birthday cards, those generic ones with pre-printed signatures and no personal message, ceased to arrive. At first, I waited for the aftershock, the inevitable attempt at repair or further manipulation. But nothing came. And in that absence, I finally understood something essential. They had never expected resistance. They had counted on my silence, my shame, my willingness to trade freedom for the illusion of care. What they couldn't fathom, what they had never taken the time to learn, was that I had spent a lifetime teaching people how to recognize false authority, how to see through well-dressed cruelty. And in the end, I had simply applied the lesson to my own life. The house grew quiet again, not in the way it had been after Virginia died, not haunted, but calm. I woke early each morning, made my coffee the way she used to, sat by the window with the newspaper, and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood rising into the day, distant dogs barking, the hum of a lawnmower, wind brushing against the eaves like an old friend returning. I began tending the garden again. The tomato vines had gone wild while I was gone, and the hydrangeas were yellowing from neglect. I took pleasure in pruning, watering, grounding myself in that simple rhythm of care without expectation. I even joined the town's historical committee again, something I hadn't done since Virginia's passing. They welcomed me back with easy laughter like no time had passed. I told them I'd been busy, and left it at that. There are some stories you don't need to retell for them to be understood. Every now and then, I'd see Sophie or Ben in photos on social media, posted by mutual acquaintances. Their lives moved on, as lives do. I didn't blame them. They were too young to see clearly what they'd been pulled into. Maybe one day when they were older they would ask questions. Maybe they wouldn't. I had made peace with both outcomes. I didn't need them to apologize. I just hoped they'd grow into people who wouldn't repeat the same games. Legacy isn't always inheritance. Sometimes it's just showing someone how to walk away with their dignity intact. Daniel called once more, weeks after everything had been finalized, just to check in. "You handled yourself with more clarity and poise than most of my clients half your age," he said. "If you ever feel like speaking about your case publicly, you could help a lot of people." I told him I'd think about it, but I already knew the answer. My life had already been turned into someone else's narrative once. I wouldn't let it become a cautionary tale for strangers. Let others fight their own battles. I'd fought mine, and I had won, not with vengeance, but with resistance. Not with rage, but with refusal. One morning, as I stood in the hallway putting on my coat, I caught my reflection in the mirror near the front door. I looked older than I remembered, but not weaker. The lines around my eyes had deepened, but so had their clarity. I no longer saw someone waiting for forgiveness or permission. I saw a man who had lived, who had lost, and who had finally learned to say no without guilt. It struck me then that aging is not the slow fading that others believe it to be. It is, in many ways, a sharpening, a narrowing of focus, the quiet revelation of what matters and what never did. I walked down to the post office later that day and mailed a final letter. Not to Caroline, not to Paul, but to the local registrar of property. Enclosed was an updated deed, officially transferring my house into a private trust, with explicit instructions that it would pass not to family, but to a local organization that provides transitional housing for veterans and elderly residents at risk of displacement. I had visited the place once and spoken with a woman who reminded me of Virginia, kind, direct, unafraid of hard truths. She told me they always ran out of beds, always needed one more room for someone the world had forgotten. I left that day knowing exactly what I wanted to do. Caroline would never understand. She would call it vindictive, petty. But it wasn't. It was restoration. I wasn't giving my house away. I was giving it back, to those who still knew what a home meant. Now I live my days not in waiting, but in presence. I read, I write, I walk without asking permission. I cook meals that don't require anyone's approval. And in the evenings I sit by the window, where Virginia once hung her wind chimes, and I listen to them sing in the breeze. I speak to her sometimes, not out of grief, but out of memory. I tell her what happened. I tell her I stood up, finally, that I walked out when they told me to stay, that I remembered who I was. And though I may die alone in this house, it will not be in shame, and it will not be in silence. It will be in truth, in peace, and most of all, in freedom.